Welcome to the Millennials and Community Podcast. Join Matt and Carlo for a topic that might make you a little bit uncomfortable as they explore the concepts of power and privilege, how you can use a handy chart to figure out whether you're benefiting from either, and how being supportive of others requires you to be aware of yourself. Thank you for being part of our community.
All right, everybody. Hello and welcome. This is your newest episode of the Millennials and Community Podcast. As always, my name is Matt. This is Carlo. It's been a while since we recorded, so it's gonna maybe take us a little bit. So maybe fast forward 2 minutes from now, and we'll work out all the kinks, and we'll see you in 2 minutes.
We don't need 2 minutes. I'm a professional.
Well, that makes one of us. Fantastic. So, as always, let's get started with our opening icebreaker. Carlo, do you have that icebreaker handy?
Yeah. If you could time travel, what era would you visit and why?
Ooh, this is really, really interesting. There's two that I would choose. I would either go back to like the early 2010s just for nostalgia value. Early 2010s is when we were like newly adults, but pretend adults, because when you're in your early 20s, you're not really an adult, you just don't know that yet. Those were good times. Alternatively, I think it would be really interesting to go back to like the roaring 20s and just see what the levels of opulence and wealth were before the Great Depression.
Oh, that's an interesting kind of idea.
Just like to juxtapose kind of different crashes that we've had in our context and see what the similarities look like.
No, I totally get it. For me, so I recently came back from Japan. I'm in the middle of watching Shogun on Disney Plus. I think I would very much enjoy going back to feudal Japan. Now, I probably wouldn't enjoy it because from what I understand at that point in time, they just killed most foreigners.
I was going to say enjoy is a weird word.
Yeah, but like in Japan, one of the things that we did is we visited an open air architecture museum. So all of the older homes going throughout the years had all been relocated to this central park in the Mitaka area of Japan. So it was really cool to see how they were constructed, how a lot of the kind of original multi-use areas made its way into more modern homes. So I really enjoyed my trip. I'm enjoying watching the show, and I think I would just enjoy to be immersed in that kind of more simple yet very kind of intentional lifestyle that it's depicted they live. I think that would be cool.
That would be really, really cool. All right, so the topic that we're going to get into today, and it's interesting that we chose eras that revolve around two very different but very dominant societies, and that's really going to really set the stage for what we're going to talk about today. I do want to preface this by saying that there's going to be a lot of what we talk about in this episode that is uncomfortable, and it's supposed to be, and we'll get into the reason why that is. But I would just encourage you that if you're listening to this today and for whatever reason you find yourself feeling a little bit you got that feeling in the pit of your stomach that just like something feels weird, that's not wrong. That's very common actually when discussing things of this nature. This is a serious topic, but it's one that I think is really important for everybody to take some time to reflect on, and that is the concept of how we navigate power and privilege in our society. Two pretty significant words with a lot of context behind them, very interrelated words. And so I think it's really important that we dive in and we have some conversations today about what it means, how we navigate our own levels of privilege and the power we get therefrom, and what we can do about it. So as far as this topic is concerned, I mean, for me, this is a big area of passion. I navigated a lot of this work, this learning as a part of my master's degree. As you can imagine, leadership and power in terms of like conversationally go very much hand in hand. So there's a lot of work to be done to better understand how to navigate power structures from a leadership standpoint. But maybe more importantly, there's a lot of conversation today about the politicization of different social issues. So whether it be talking about relationships between or how us as a society tries to support or, in unfortunate circumstances, like suppress any sort of equity deserving groups. There's a lot of politicization of the fact of any group that tries to stand up and try to create a scenario where they get more power where they traditionally haven't. And so I think that, we need to work to debunk some of these things. There's the word woke that also gets politicized a whole lot. And so want to have a bit of a conversation around why the word woke is such an issue and feels so threatening to a lot of people, and just really debunk some of the myths around what things go into creating privilege, how privilege is constructed. And realistically, I'm just hoping that everyone leaves this episode with the opportunity to understand a little bit more about how they're positioned in society, and then what sorts of advantages and disadvantages might be carried through that.
Now, in terms of why we would want to have an understanding about the privileges that we are, that we are given, in my mind, that comes down to being able to empathize and understand what other people are going through. So if you are part of a category where you have a lot more privilege and opportunity than another category might have, if you want to be in support of equal rights across the board, you have to have an understanding of what you are in essence bringing to the table in that fight, and how you might be able to support other people that don't have the same level of privilege. Would you say I'm right about that idea?
Yeah, definitely on the right track. I mean, ultimately, the empathy is a really important word to use here, and so I'm glad that you brought it up, because realistically, when we are better able to understand the things in which contribute to our own privilege, you're right, we're better to understand how other people might be positioned. But I think, and something that I want to hammer home, that if you take one thing away from this episode, that when we talk about privilege, these things are so layered, there's so much nuance into the things that contribute to somebody's identity, that it's so hard to paint anybody with the same brush just because we think stereotypically they might belong to the same groups.
Yeah, and like when we historically on the show, we've used the words privileged and blessed a lot when we talk about trying to encourage people to do certain things, take on new challenges, travel, hobbies, etc. Well, those are all things that we have found joy and love in, but only by pushing us past certain comfort zones allow us to get there. Here's the thing though, is that for some less privileged people, it's not so much less a push through a comfort zone as it is a complete paradigm shift into the way they live their lives for us to do things that we might seem trivial. So, we've used those terms in a lot of contexts here, but I think that this episode is going to be really interesting to kind of bring it together and make us appreciate that even a little bit more.
For sure. So let's dive in, because for some of you, you might hear the word power and privilege, have kind of a conceptual idea of what these things are, but let's kind of get out in front and talk about what we mean when we say these things. So first of all, privilege is the advantages, the benefits that individuals might innately have just due to their standing in life, the social groups, the different identity structures that they might be a part of. So for example, you kind of think, and we'll dig a little bit more detail into this in a couple minutes, but you think about the classic straight white man, right? In so many ways in our Western systems, the straight white man has the highest degree of privilege, and therefore power, which is the ability to influence decisions. This is not a coincidence. This is not a surprise, given that the systems that we're talking about were created by straight white men. And rightly or wrongly, historically, a lot of times wrongly, these systems were created to benefit the people who created them, right? So it's no surprise that straight white men are really like the top of the food chain when it comes to discussions about privilege and power. So that's kind of the first thing. There's a cyclical relationship between these things, right? When you have more privilege, you have the opportunity to amass more power. And I use the word opportunity very, very intentionally, because people are certainly able to create power for themselves in spite of having lesser privileges. But that actually takes me to the next sort of definitions, which are kind of important in this discussion. And I will pause here to say that these things are incredibly detailed. There are courses and degrees and certifications that you can take in this stuff. So it's simply a very, very high level, but we can't talk about power and privilege without having a quick conversation about EDI. Now, you may have heard of this as EDI, DEI, EDID. There's multiple different combinations and permutations of this acronym. They all roughly mean the same thing. It's equity, diversity, inclusion. When you see the second D, sometimes referred to as decolonization, is added in that acronym. Sometimes you'll get A for accessibility put in there. For today's terms, let's stick with equity, diversity, and inclusion. Equity is very simply the idea that all of us are going to have the same level of opportunity to do a thing. Now, this is very, very different from equality, because equality states that you and I are going to be given the same resources to be able to accomplish a thing. Now, of course, the difference is if I'm in a wheelchair and you are fully able-bodied, equality would suggest that we both only have to climb 3 stairs to get into a house. Well, if I'm in a wheelchair, 3 stairs is quite a bit more difficult to navigate. So we need to understand at a fundamental level that equity basically states that everyone has the same opportunity as each other, meaning there's a ramp available to me. You may have to get up 3 flights of stairs. Relative to the positionality that we have, this is maybe pretty similar in terms of our ability to access an opportunity. Diversity is just an understanding that all of us are different. All of us come with these different inherent structures and positions and identifying markers and social groups that we're a part of, either by choice or not. And these play a role into who we are. Inclusion is the extent to which we're able to create a safe space for people from diverse backgrounds, positions, social groups, etc.
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, this EDI or this EDIDA is generally like a set of guiding principles. So if you're an organization that's trying to be as inclusive and as understanding of privilege as possible, you use this acronym whenever you're creating a program, you're factoring in something else. It's a set of guiding principles.
Right. So organizations, programs, corporations, municipalities, all across the board now, you hear EDI quite a lot for exactly that purpose, right? We're trying to create spaces that promote equitable opportunity to everybody. Now, there's a whole lot of discourse around this, but at its foundation, that's the goal of it.
Sure.
So we've talked about power and privilege. We've defined EDI for those of you that might be previously unfamiliar with the acronym. The next important part to think about here is the idea of intersectionality. Now, intersectionality, really, really big word. But this comes back to what I was saying a few minutes ago of the fact that all of the work that we need to do to understand our own identity is recognizing that everybody is unique. That seems like a platitude, seems super cliche, but if we think about all of the different markers that make us who we are, it's roughly speaking some combination of our sex, our gender, our sexuality, the degree to which we're able-bodied, our ethnicity, our social class, our the languages we speak, our skin color, our citizenship. All of these things individually are different components of our identity. The idea of intersectionality essentially just says that every one of those unique markers, when combined together, determines the degree to which somebody has more or less privilege. So there's this tool that we'll post on the Discord. It's called the Wheel of Power and Privilege. And it's a really, really wonderful visual because what it allows us to do is take a look at different identity structures and understand where we experience more privilege or less privilege based on our different structures. So for example, I mentioned straight white man. Well, a straight white man who is a quadriplegic experiences less privilege than a straight white man who is able-bodied. a straight white man who is able-bodied and is wealthy, right? Who speaks English, who has a Canadian citizenship. These are things that are remarkably more privileged. And so it's the opportunity for us to understand and really acknowledge where we are in terms of a relationship to other people and why that might give us advantages in life.
Now, when you sent me the episode prep, I looked up this wheel, this link that you sent, and there was a couple things I noticed. One, I had no idea that something like this even existed. It totally makes sense that it does, but the fact that this was a resource available on the Government of Canada website kind of threw me off a little bit. I didn't expect to see it there. Again, it makes sense. I'm happy that it's there, but I didn't know that it was. And one of the first questions that I had, considering that this was available on the Government of Canada website, it would make sense that this wheel is specific to the privileges and the categories for Canada. And I think there's even a disclaimer on the bottom that says this is built from a Canadian viewpoint. So would it make sense to believe that if every country in the world had one of these wheels, that it would be drastically different depending on like our cultures and all that kind of stuff? So like if you were to take an Asian community such as Japan and vary it up against our wheel, do you think they would have a different wheel?
Really, really interesting question. And actually the example of Japan is very, very fascinating. So in some components, so I'll read off to you some of the things from the wheel. So right off the wheel, you've got gender, sex, sexuality, able-bodiedness or degree of physical ability, neurodiversity, mental health, language, formal education, housing, wealth, citizenship, the degree to which you are Indigenous, your skin color. So we think about things that there are certainly things that are going to be culturally universal versus culturally relative. Things like your language certainly would be contingent, right? If you're in Japan, you are going to experience more privilege because if you're able to speak Japanese, sure, or if you're able to speak multiple languages, some of those things are true. However, what's really, really fascinating when we get to the root of understanding how power has been accumulated, power in the way we're talking about it really, really links back to colonization. So when the original European powers went out and they colonized different regions of the world, obviously North America being chief among them, you started to see the basically structures of white European colonialist nations supersede others. So it's really interesting to hear you say what happens in other countries. If you look at many Asian countries, Japan being one of them, there is a heavy priority given to people who look more white, right? There's a couple of reasons for that. One is there is the cultural notion of if I'm more white, I am more privileged. Part of it is because of those colonial histories. The other part of it is this assumption that if I'm more tanned, it means that I am a laborer because I've had to go out in the sun and do all this hard work. And therefore someone with more of a tan is probably less privileged because they've had to go outside and do hard labor.
Interesting.
So yes, there are certain things that are going to be culturally and geographically contingent. However, more so than you would think, everything, all paths lead back to the rich white man.
Okay.
So it's important to understand and acknowledge this. And one of the things, just to kind of jump to our make actions count that we're going to suggest to everybody, is that you go and take a look at this wheel of power and privilege and start to understand it's not ever to suggest that we can't that we don't experience hardship just because we're straight white guys, right? I like to joke that I have a special like hyper privilege because I'm half white and half Chinese, and surely that's going to get me some like hyper privilege down the line. But the idea is
I'll keep my mouth shut on that one.
We want to be able to understand the privileges that we carry, because with every level of privilege comes certain biases and stereotypes that we are not necessarily conscious to. And so it helps us to understand those things. And therefore, like you mentioned early on, allows us to be more empathetic.
Yeah. Okay. So, if somebody's going to pull up this wheel here, explain quickly kind of how it works. so that, we can have an understanding of that.
For sure. So I'll use me as an example. If I'm going to look at this wheel for myself, I'm going to start from my sex is male. My gender is a cisgendered male, which means I identify as a man and I was born as a man. For those who are not familiar with cisgender, it simply means that you identify as the same gender that relates to the biological sex that you're born as. So both of those things, top of the pyramid, well, it's not a pyramid, it's a circle. So those things are closer to the center of the wheel. And the way this tool is constructed, the closer you are to the center, the more higher degree of privilege you have. Sexuality, I identify as heterosexual. That's going to be center of the wheel. Anybody on the 2S LGBTQ2IA plus spectrum is going to be furthest to the outside. Interestingly, if you see this wheel, you'll notice that gay men are specifically listed as having higher privilege than other groups from the LGBTQ2IA plus spectrum. And that's, again, a statement that men generally have higher privilege. So if you've got a gay man and a gay woman, because you're a man, you still experience high privilege.
Okay.
Persons with disabilities. Of course, if I don't have any physical disabilities that ail me, I'm perfectly able-bodied. So again, center of the wheel. Neurodiversity. I feel that I'm fairly neurotypical. I mean, these things are a spectrum, so it's not like a binary thing, but I identify as fairly neurotypical, center of the wheel. Mental health. My mental health is stable, center of the wheel. I speak English, center of the wheel. Now, you mentioned this being a Canadian relevant thing, so they do state in this tool that if you are bilingual in both the official languages of Canada, which is English and French for our non-Canadian friends, then that would be the highest level of privilege. But I would argue that that's probably just pulling at straws, because there's only 2 provinces in Canada that French really does anything for you.
So essentially with this tool, you can give yourself an overall gauge of how this tool views you in terms of how much privilege you have.
Well, yes and no. I mean, this tool is really just a visual aid to help understand. What we have to understand, again, is if we look at all of these things that are in the center of this wheel. So read them off again: heterosexual, male, white, European settler, wealthy, property owners, post-secondary education, stable mental health. Again, it's no surprise that our societies in a Western way were built. Our systems were built by people that have those identities, by landowners who obviously, by virtue of having being landowners, had accumulated wealth, right? And the people that accumulated wealth set the success metrics for the rest of society. And so they came into this saying, well, this is what we are, therefore we are the pinnacle of society. So the checklist for how successful anybody else is going to be is predicated on their ability to get close to us.
Okay. So again, because I love to take devil advocate when we have a lot of these things, somebody who is either less open to this entire realm of what we're talking about, where they're like, everybody's got a fair shot at life, and, I work just as hard as the next person, or whatever the mentality they may be. If I were to take the viewpoint of that kind of person, the questions that I would be asking is, one, who decided that the stuff in the center is the most privileged? And 2, who decided what went on the board? Right? Like where is this coming from? And it doesn't matter where they fall on the wheel themselves, but how come this is created? Who decided that this, the white cisgendered property owner is the guy that has the most privilege? Because maybe that guy is a white cisgendered property owner. He goes, I don't feel like I have privilege. Which is a massive question, I'm sure.
Okay. So, I mean, and it's a fair question, because there's a lot of people out there. And I know one of the myths that I think is really important to debunk is that, there's no such thing as privilege. There's only hard work.
Sure.
Which, ironically, I only ever hear from, middle class or higher straight white dudes. But that notwithstanding, if we want to actually take it back to the really, really, far historical perspective, this comes back to the Doctrine of Discovery, which was a document published by the Catholic Church that basically justified Catholics and Christians in the name of spreading the word of the Bible to as many different regions of the world as possible. The Doctrine of Discovery said that basically thou shalt go to as many places in the world as possible and espouse the Bible and Christianity. And basically this document set the context for cultural genocide of everybody else that are not Caucasian Christians. And this is a historical document that, by the way, like the Catholic Church has not completely disavowed yet. They've made amends in some ways and tried to apologize for certain atrocities made in the interest of expanding the Catholic Church and other Christian faiths. However, when we talk about what makes the center of the wheel the center, it was the Pope in, I don't remember the exact year, 14 or 15 something, when they wrote this doctrine and basically justified any followers of Christian faiths to go around the world and commit cultural genocide to indigenous peoples in any other place in the world.
So that is a very specific answer that I was not expecting out of you. To think that the idea of what we view today as some of the most privileged people was literally set out in a document that we can historically view is, I was not expecting that. So great answer. Right there, any doubt that I would have in the validity of this document, I think is answered. Not to say that I questioned it that much before, but like to basically say like, here you go, this is, we are the pinnacle of society. Now go make everybody fit that doctrine. Yeah. That's the historical stamp for like, no wonder where we're at right now.
It's compelling. And it's, unfortunately, so much of then what has happened since. And you come all the way up to today in 2024, and you look at the way that Indigenous peoples are still treated. And the fact that the Indian Act, which was a central piece of legislation enacted by the government of Canada, that was really the intention of the Indian Act was to commit cultural genocide to Indigenous peoples in Canada, and that legislation is still in force today. It really speaks to the fact that, so your question of like who decided what was at the center of the wheel, it was really just the combination of the evolution of the Doctrine of Discovery, but then as colonial powers started to settle different places around the world, you started to have people recognize that the more that I can become like the straight white colonized men, the more power I'm going to have the opportunity to amass. Right? So you think about the idea, the concept of hard work. We've talked in previous episodes how hard work is something that is, we have a different conception in Western society of the value and the importance of hard work. But you see hard work, it's the classic American dream, right? And the American dream has its roots here too. And you're trying to work hard to amass that wealth, to own property, and you're basically trying to pull yourself towards the middle of the wheel. All people, I think, strive to live a life where they're able to create lives for themselves that have more power. I don't think they do this intentionally, certainly if you haven't seen the wheel before, but the goal really is to work towards more of the middle of the wheel, because again, with more privilege, more power, more opportunity to create a better life for us and our family, all of these things are intertwined. What I don't think people necessarily realize is that by doing that, you end up kind of like reinforcing, ironically, the structures that are built.
And I was going to say is that, I think there's maybe two directions with it. Is historically, we may be trying to bring ourselves into the center of the wheel, but now in today's age, it looks more like we're trying to pull that wheel out further towards us. Right. Which is really the major battle that is being fought in a lot of these less privileged communities. So I guess to kind of keep the conversation moving along, we're at a little bit more of an idea of what this is, but with this being the Millennials and Community podcast, like what does that actually mean? Why is this such a big topic for us?
Yeah. So as with a lot of things we've discussed before, millennials find themselves sandwiched between generations in a fairly significant way. That's relatively unique. Of course, we've got Gen Y, Gen X boomers older than us. We've got the Gen Zs and then Generation Alpha coming into their early teens now. And what we notice is that there is a huge, huge, huge gap in the way that the newer generations, the younger generations, are interacting with these power structures. And I actually really, really love what you just said, and is very, very compelling about how in our parents' generation, our grandparents' generation, without even necessarily knowing it, you're working to move towards the center of the wheel of power. Whereas now younger generations are saying, well, to hell with that. If we're going to dismantle these traditional power structures, I'm going to try to create my own wheel, and I'm going to try to draw others to the center of my own wheel, or at least have people respect the fact that I don't want to exist on this wheel that you've created. And I think that's really, really powerful. You see that a whole lot. And I think that that's where the conversation goes when we start seeing people that are a part of this traditional wheel of power and privilege start to speak out like, oh, what's woke? We're too woke. We're too this. We're too that. And I think that that's a really good way of describing where a lot of this friction comes in. And so millennials, I think, because millennials still a fairly broad aged, like a wide age range. And so you're going to have a lot of perspectives that are in between. And I think for a lot of millennials, it's incumbent on us to recognize that we have many privileges as a result of the hard work, the work that our parents or grandparents did to bring our families closer to the center of the circle, while still recognizing that these power structures very much do exist, and recognize that we need to hold space and recognize that as privileged individuals, that I certainly identify as a privileged individual, it's my role to try to, on some level, amplify the perspectives and the voices of groups that are not as close to the middle of the wheel as I am.
Okay. I think a lot of I can totally see where the pushback comes from, because anytime somebody in a position of power is told you need to share some of that power, there's going to be friction with that.
Yep.
I think another part that becomes difficult for people is when you are in a position of privilege, I would say, are less aware of that privilege. So when somebody comes in and starts saying, well, we want some of that privilege you have, it feels a little bit of an attack. It's like, what do you mean? I don't have privilege. I worked hard. I pulled up my bootstraps and I got here, right? Where the reality is they don't know. And when we start to think about woke culture, a lot of these politicians and big talking heads love to talk about how many letters there are in the LGBTQ plus community. There, why we keep adding things, and why there's different genders, and why there's this and why there's that. Why is it necessary to have the label? Well, it's necessary to have the label because that's the first step in reclaiming and allowing that community to have a little bit more privilege, is because you can't organize, you can't pull that power away towards something else if you don't know what you're pulling it to.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of one of the really tricky parts is any sort of equity deserving group recognizes that if you are a part of a minority, whatever the minority is, you don't gain power by continuing to be a part of a minority. So you in some way need to try to build a coalition and band together certain groups that you feel have similar lived experiences, or that at the very least are not objectionable to group together in the hopes of amassing more power in numbers. And I think that's exactly what you mean.
Yeah. And I know that, again, bringing back to the idea of why this is relevant for millennials, I think if you would ask the vast majority of people our age right now and say, hey, well, how united do you feel the world is? Yeah. Most of us be like, we're not. It's dog eat dog out there. Everybody's out on their own. And it really feels like that. And I think that's partially due to the fact that there are so many minority groups that are all striving, like they're looking at it as an opportunity. Like right now is our time. Right now is to pull hard. We have the support from certain organizations, from certain people. Let's go and we do this. And I think the vast majority of people are on board for that, but it still makes the world feel very fragmented. We're not divided by borders anymore. We're divided by ideological positions, and we're divided by so much. And that can be really frustrating, especially when you are the kind of person that just says like, why can't everybody be equal? Why can't we all just be on the same level playing field, right? Where I don't personally care whether this person has that right to do this or not do that. Like, let them live their life, let them do what they want to do, just like I have that privilege. So it's such a divided time right now. No matter what position I think you're in, I think you can agree that like the world feels like it's constantly at each other's throats.
Yeah, and there's so much here. I want to, you mentioned bootstraps, and it reminded me of a fantastic Eminem lyric. I can't recall what song it is, but Eminem in this lyric basically says like, they told me to just pull myself up by my bootstraps, but where the fuck are the boots? Like, and it's just like such a really just on the nose lyric that basically suggests exactly what you're saying. And there's the idea of why can't we all be equal? Why can't we all play on the same level? Well, remember, equality assumes that we all have the same barrier put in front of us, but what it doesn't understand is what sorts of ability we have to go in to interact with the barrier. So the classic kind of metaphor for this, you've got three people trying to look over a fence, right? And you've got you've got one that's 6 feet tall, one that's 4 feet tall, and one that's 2 feet tall. I don't know what type of folks we're talking about. Maybe we're talking about kids, doesn't matter. And you say that equality would be saying to them, all right, we're going to give everybody a 6-inch tall phone book to stand on. You all have equal opportunity to look over the fence. Well, the person who's 6 feet tall, they could see over the fence to begin with. They didn't need the phone book. The person who's 4 feet tall, great. That phone book gives them enough height to see over the fence. And then 2 foot tall person's like, well, what? Like, I still can't see over this fence. So equity rather is the idea that, okay, so we're going to give everybody what they need to be able to equitably see over the fence.
Which, you know, if we think about it on a community level, is another pain point, because, you know, we think about the idea of how much taxes in Canada we pay. Well, we pay some of the largest amount of taxes for a lot of different reasons, but ideologically, one of those reasons is to provide everybody in a less privileged position the tools and the resources they need to be on that level playing field. Now, does it happen in actuality? Yeah, less likely than we would like to see, but that is kind of the idea, is that somebody who is in a better financial position is allowing somebody else the same opportunity and the same resources to get themselves to potentially that financial position. And that is something that we're seeing a lot not of right now, is we're seeing a lot of wealth hoarded in the top 1%. You and I were talking about an example before we started recording about the Met Gala and Haley Bailey's post and that backlash. But I do truly believe that we're starting to see this push of like, we're tired of all of the have-nots and all of the people that don't have anything watching the world that has everything. And it's just getting ridiculous. So I think it's an exciting time, not only for, you know, some less represented groups to hopefully come out better from it, but it's an exciting time to see how the world can band together to hopefully equalize and brings things to a better place for everyone.
Yeah, and I mentioned this is uncomfortable. This is uncomfortable for good reason, right? Like the conversations, if you take the conversations that we're having and you take them to a logical conclusion, it means creating new systems that significantly upset the way that societies function, at least in Western civilizations, right? Like we're talking about the difference between monumental shifts in the way that our political systems work, our businesses are organized, the way that our lives are governed. Like there's so many things that are different. And if, again, you're listening to this and you feel weird or you feel upset or you feel angry, those are all very reasonable things, because every time we talk about this, it feels threatening. If you're someone in the center of the wheel and you see a group of people saying, you know what, I'm going to go start my own wheel, obviously you're going to feel attacked. You're going to feel threatened. But then, it's very easy to imagine if you don't see yourself with a high degree of privilege in this wheel, it's very understandable that you'd want to go and create some sort of a situation for yourself where you feel more a part of that community and that wheel.
Well, and that's why I say this is so exciting, because never before in history has there been such a massive amount of people that don't feel threatened by that wheel expanding, right? Like, if you look at it, the people that are really going to be threatened about the distribution of wealth, the distribution of power, are the ones with wealth and power.
Yep.
Where the vast majority of the population in the world does not have an overwhelming amount of wealth and power.
Yep.
So we don't mind that being distributed. It might actually mean that we get a little bit more, but so does everybody else, right? So there's this kind of idea that the wealthy upper class and societal classes have almost done this to themselves by hoarding everything, hoarding money, hoarding opportunity, hoarding privilege. They've just taken that away from the people that historically would have supported them in a time like this. And now we're going, nah, let's for once and for all, let's make this for everybody, not just one or two people.
Yeah, it's a good point. And so that leads me, when we talk about, how this kind of impacts community, I wanted to double down and just say, again, remember that one of the important parts of this wheel is to remember that everybody's different, because even if two people have the same social class, or they live in the same community, or they speak the same language, all of these other identifying markers may be different. And so it's really important to remember that if you interact with two people from a seemingly similar identifying group, that they are still different. The other thing that I want to really capture here, and this is really important, because as people with privilege and power, you're talking about redistributing wealth. You actually just said power. I shouldn't put words in your mouth, which is really what we're talking about here. We're not outright suggesting, like, I'm not out here saying we eat the rich. Like, this is not where I'm going. What I'm trying to suggest is that we just need to be aware that when we're looking for ways to increase the amount of power experienced by people from less privileged intersectionalities, what we need to remember is that it's so important to do with, not do for. And so we tend to have this idea. Take charity as an example, right? We're going to give to charity, and we're going to give all this money to be able to create a better life for people in whatever sort of underprivileged or disadvantaged situation. Well, when we do things for people, you're acknowledging that they are underprivileged, which it enables their lack of privilege and doesn't necessarily give them an opportunity to be a part of their own empowerment. So it basically limits their ability to step towards the center of the wheel. And B, we shouldn't be the people that get to decide what would actually increase the amount of advantage or privilege. Right? They should be a part of that conversation, because, as you say, in a world where we're creating different sets of wheels and we're prioritizing different cultural values, different ways of being, different types of knowledge, we need to bring them into the into the conversation and do things with them to ensure that whatever ways that we're collectively working to increase power and redistribute power are in alignment with the ways, right? Because if we just say, oh, this will make you have more power, ironically, we're just trying to give them power in the traditional sense and not necessarily in a way that aligns with their traditional backgrounds.
Yeah. And this is a really interesting one for me. And I think charity is a good analog for the overall thing I'm thinking, is that if I wanted to try and support someone gaining more privilege, gaining more rights, because I don't fall within that category, I don't know what it is that group might need or want. Exactly. But I want to try and help. So that is a personal battle that I have with myself, to try and do that in a way that I feel is supportive. And I think a lot of people are hesitant to do that kind of stuff because they don't know how it will be received by the community they're attempting to help. It's a little scary, right? So, on one hand, when we think about it in the idea of charity, is that I want to give my charity for my own reasons, and I don't want to ever feel persecuted by that charity for me wanting to help out. So I think it's something that is important on both sides to kind of consider, is that I don't know what I don't know. So when I'm trying to help in the way that I can, please be accommodating of the fact that I don't know what I don't know. Does that make sense?
It does. So when I think about that, a lot of people, when they're confronted with this information, sometimes there's a sense of denial, sometimes there's a sense of like guilt, right? And there's this like, wow, I have experienced a lot of privilege in my life, and there's kind of the light bulb moment, the aha moment of just how privileged people are sometimes when they interact with this. But it's very important that if we're trying to better our community and create environments where people can experience more power in spite of their level of privileges, we need to understand what our intentions are. And it's very, very important that we do not come at this from a place of trying to alleviate our own guilt. Mm-hmm. And that's something that it's a challenge that I think about a lot. Is our generation is going to be at the very forefront of trying to create changes, hopefully not band-aids, but actually meaningful change to address these like systems of power, these systemic power things. But it's hard because we're still benefiting from them. And so we just need to be really aware that when we're feeling guilt, when we're trying to do good things, that we're not doing them to try to satiate our own guilt, right? And it's not the job of an underprivileged group or individual to try to make us feel better about our own guilt as privileged people. That's not their job. They have enough to deal with than to try to forgive us for the guilt that we feel. And instead, it's we've talked about allyship in previous episodes. Our job is to really stand with these populations, stand with these social groups, and allow them the space to advocate for themselves and to use our platforms to help do that. And really, like, that's the only way that we really, really meaningfully move this work forward. It's not about doing these little gestures to try to alleviate our own personal guilt, because making ourselves feel better isn't going to further this work of trying to support equity deserving groups in our societies.
Okay, so that kind of very organically brings us into the make actions count portion of this. So what you're saying is that if you feel you fall under a privileged portion of that wheel, your job is to identify that. Use the tools, use the wheel, figure out where you are, get an understanding of what that means, how that actually affects your life. And then by using that understanding, it should allow you to open up space for these other groups to advocate for themselves.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, I think it's really easy to understand the straight white man thing. But again, the wheel of privilege and power does such a great job of outlining that there are many more dimensions to this than someone's, gender, ethnicity, and sexual orientation, right? Like there's more than those things. So yes, step number one for sure. And I would even love to challenge you. I know that this tool is newer to you, but I would love it for you to like take a minute and reflect on, how you identify yourself in that field.
Like I did that during our episode prep, and I think there's maybe 2 categories. I'm not right in the center.
Yeah.
So
it's understanding that. It also gives us an opportunity. We talk a lot about reflection in the Make Actions Count section. It gives us another opportunity to learn a little bit more about ourselves, right? And that's a really exciting opportunity anytime we have the ability to do it. But that's not designed to elicit guilt. It's just designed to understand that anyone closest to the center should feel accountable and have kind of enhanced responsibility for doing more. So that's the one thing that I would ask is try to give yourselves the opportunity to understand your levels of privilege, understand what that means for you, and how you're willing to show up in your communities as a result thereof. And I think these things are really important. And I will, if you're still feeling right now like this has been a waste of the last 40 minutes of your life listening to this podcast, I just want to point out that any of you that are listening right now that have the technological means to listen to our podcast means you have some sort of privilege, right? So like there are baselines to these things. You might not be at the center of the wheel, but it's very important to understand how we are positioned within it, because to your point, understanding that allows us to better empathize with people who are in different circumstances, which ultimately makes us better human beings.
So I'm almost hesitant to ask this, but like I came into this episode, I admitted wholeheartedly to you, like this is going to be a Matt episode. I'm going to be responding. It's not my wheelhouse. I don't understand a lot of it, but I'm curious. So this is my question for you, and this might be a dangerous question. When we look at a lot of the quote unquote, as have been labeled, woke culture people, okay, so you see this university student who falls under a very privileged section of that circle, but they become the loudest voice for the underprivileged.
Yeah.
Why? Because we've just talked about how that could come from a sense of guilt. Is that what's happening for a lot of these people? And I get everybody's unique. Everybody has their own reasons. But like, if the real way of support is to just provide space for these groups to advocate for themselves, how do you explain that behavior from that person?
Ooh, that's a great question. And for those of you that might not be listening to this episode right as this comes out, this is particularly sensitive right now because we're in the early May 2024, and what we're seeing across North America is a series of protests that have turned into encampments on university campuses around North America. Columbia University, New York, McGill in Montreal, even the University of Calgary had an incident that involved police intervention into one of these protests just yesterday, relative to when we're recording. So there's a couple of things that I would say. One, I think that Generation Z is the first generation that is not willing to let things just sort themselves out. I think that they are the first generation to really experience a systemic distrust of power structures, governments, the UN, name your gigantic multinational NGOs. There's just like not a lot of faith, not a lot of trust in these big institutions, because this generation understands this stuff. They understand where the power is concentrated, and there's just kind of by nature a distrust of where this power is centered. So on one hand, I think they're trying to take some power into their own hands and use the platforms that they have to try to make a statement of what they think is right. I think part of it is probably some level of internalized guilt, although I would imagine that you would be hard-pressed to find a 20-year-old university student participating in any of these protests that sees their participation in the protest as some sort of expression of deep-seated guilt due to privilege. I also I also struggle because it feels like a lot of these, from interviews you'll see of individuals participating in these protests, that there isn't the one thing that I struggle with is there doesn't seem to be a historical understanding of the context of a lot of the conflicts or issues that they're protesting. So if I was to wish one thing for Gen Z, it's not for them to, by any means, to shut up. I would never ask that. I want them to continue to advocate, but I would love for them to do more of the work to understand the historical context, because some of the things that they'll protest on and for are incredibly challenging, nuanced, and the ways in which they're asking for them are not necessarily realistic. And I have to check my own biases with that too, because there's a lot of my millennial colonized viewpoints in that too. So I'm even struggling saying those words. What I think is going to be a really fascinating thing, and just to wrap up and answer to your question, when I say Gen Z is not content, they're going to be constantly pushing the envelope in terms of understanding the way that we think about, recognize, and act in and around global issues that are happening. And you talk about coalitions being formed. So you'll see 2S LGBTQIA plus individuals and groups and communities banding together with BIPOC communities and individuals. For those of you not familiar, that's Black, Indigenous, people of color. You see Indigenous peoples really, really banding together with pro-Palestine movements, because that's seen as like causes. And so to our point from earlier, you're seeing these coalitions designed and built. So again, when you talk about the degree to which that you see these younger people, I think it really, really just comes down to the fact that, like I said earlier, they are not content with the current power structures. They don't trust current power structures, and they're using the platforms available to them to try to enact change.
Thank you for the answer. I think that's as best an explanation as I could have expected for such a broad question. All right, so this has been a heavy episode. Maybe you were a little uncomfortable. Maybe this is something you talk about all the time. Who knows? I really enjoyed this topic of conversation because it is something that I'm not terribly familiar with. So I appreciate the input that you've brought, Matt. So as we kind of close off here, let's do our closing icebreaker. And if you were to imagine a community initiative that promotes inclusivity, what's one that comes to mind? And I would imagine you've got a few.
Yeah, I do. One that I want to shout out right now, just because it's near and dear to my heart, and it's a little bit of a shameless plug because it comes within the organization that I work. But the organization that I work with, Alberta Recreation and Parks Association, we have a program called Community Compass. And Community Compass is a government-funded program where we are working to build we're looking to build capacity for employers in recreation and parks to be better equipped to employ diverse individuals. And likewise, we're trying to create pathways and connections for folks from equity deserving groups, whether that be Indigenous peoples, new Canadians, folks that have some sort of physical disability. We're trying to increase the pathways for them to consider careers in recreation and parks. Mm-hmm. And it's a really cool marriage in a sense, because recreation and parks saw a drastic decline in our staffing capacity over COVID. People that got laid off from their jobs as lifeguards or other sorts of recreation staff that were not that were laid off during the pandemic just went and found other work. So there's still massive holes in these very good career opportunities. So that's a really cool program that I get to be kind of like on the front row seats of watching it unfold with our team that's working on that project to try to create more linkages for employers to do better at employing diverse individuals, but also giving pathways and ways for diverse individuals to find those jobs.
See, and I knew that you'd be able to instantly have one in mind that you would want to talk about and promote. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't really have one near and dear to me. And that is an area of concern for me, I think. So something that I would definitely want to spend a little bit more time thinking, maybe spending a little bit of time volunteering and becoming involved with. So I'm going to leave this question unanswered with I don't know, a to be decided, to be found kind of area, which I think is as good an answer as I can give right now.
So I think that takes us into our gratitudes. And I just want to say that I'm tremendously grateful to you. We talked about this as a potential episode topic about a month and a half ago. And then we didn't really talk about it much since. We knew this was kind of going to be near to the list of episodes to come out. And then it just kind of happened. And I will admit that I've done a lot of work on this stuff, right? Like this was a big part of my master's. It's very central to the work that I do in social purpose organizations. So it's kind of at the forefront for me in a way that it's not for you and for, I imagine, a lot of people listening. Like I mentioned, this is uncomfortable stuff, and I'm just so appreciative that you'd be willing to have this conversation with such a sense of curiosity, such a sense of desire to learn. It's the same desire to learn that you bring to everything, but that you were able to apply this in a way. And I just felt that you were really, you asked such great questions, and you were humble, and you admitted the things that you didn't know. And I just really appreciate that you would come to kind of a really disarming conversation with that level of openness and vulnerability.
Well, I appreciate that because like I said, I acknowledge I don't know what I don't know. And this kind of brings me into my gratitude is that I'm very thankful for the fact that you have this diverse outlook on so many things in life, and you're exposed to things that I am not. And you're so willing to share them in a patient and understanding way. Like, I always feel like I have to be very careful with some people about the way I ask certain questions, because I never intend to offend. I only intend to learn. And, when I ask you a question, I know that you're never going to look at me and go, well, you shouldn't have asked that. That was wrong, right? You look at me from that lens of he's legitimately trying to understand and learn. So that patience and that understanding, I know, is something that you extend to everybody. So I'm very grateful for that.
Thank you.
Well, guys, thank you for joining us for this episode of the Millennials and Community Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the in-depth discussion, the curiosity, the learning that I had on this episode. So I just want to say that it's been a little while since we recorded one of these. It feels wonderful to be back, wonderful to be discussing these good things. We're very happy and thankful for you guys to be along for the ride. And I don't know, Matt, you want to close this out?
Yeah, again, just keep being curious. If this stuff feels uncomfortable, it's okay. It's supposed to feel weird. Any sort of change feels weird, and we're talking about being at the precipice of some really big change. And if you have questions, reach out. Like I said, I've had a lot of exposure, but I'm not an expert, and I would love to have conversations with you, regardless of your feelings or thoughts about this sort of thing. So stay curious. Connect with us as always. You know where to find us on the social media platforms, and we hope that you take this opportunity to chat with us more on Discord. And hope you all have a wonderful day. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, guys. See you next time. Hi, guys. It's Carlo here. Thank you for listening to our latest episode. It's the support of our community like you that allows us to continue to grow and make this into something truly extraordinary. If you enjoyed today's episode and you would like to listen to it without the interruption of ads and maybe even experience some bonus content, I'd invite you to join us on our newly launched Patreon. And if maybe that's not something you can do right now, please consider liking, subscribing, sharing, and commenting on places like YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, Facebook, all that good stuff. You'll find us under @Millennials and Community for pretty much all of those. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you again soon.